very happy that you wanted to join Azure Thursday, Lisa, and share all your excitement about data engineering.
Yeah, I'm very happy that you guys asked me to be here tonight. So thank you for that, I would say. It's an honor to be here. So yeah, but a pity that Ronald couldn't join. I didn't know that. So yeah, sorry to hear.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, we
very important.
upgraded you to our most favorite guest of the evening.
Yeah, you're opening keynote and closing keynote at the same
Yes.
time. So
I
Yeah,
didn't
we
expect
decided
anything
to give
less.
to not have you share the stage with anyone else except for Roland and me.
I mean, I'm such a big presence. I totally get it. Yeah, yeah. Makes sense.
Oh, I do apologize up front for my bad sense of humor. But I'm happy that you're still sticking around, Lisa, to persevere and get to that fun stuff with your presentation.
Well, if you see me drop
Um,
off, you know what happens. I'll be crying on the
yes.
toilet. I'll
Okay.
be back
Yes.
soon in that case. Yes.
we'll
Okay.
make
In
sure
that
that
case,
doesn't happen. Yeah.
yeah, because now it's not in person, so there's no way to do some crisis management here.
No,
And as
no
Roland
hugs.
meant, oh, okay, I'll try to tone it down. Because some of you who have already seen me hosting Azure Thursday know that I have this annoying habit of trying to break the ice with some unexpected impromptu speaking kind of questions. I think the most famous one was asking what your favorite Disney princess is, but I figured with the tweet that I saw today that you, Lisa, are also prepping a session for the festive tech calendar
Yes.
about a pet python. So
Yes.
I frantically tried to search how many Disney snakes or pythons were in the movies. I did discover more than I thought because the only one that I knew was Kaa, the snake
Hmm.
that tried to manipulate Mowgli in Jungle Book. But I discovered that in Robin Hood there was also a snake, so, which, um, which lispelled. Or
Oh, yeah.
correct term, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, so I'm not gonna annoy you with that question. I'll just keep the focus on feeling uncomfortable myself.
That's
With
always good.
of
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Um, but yeah, I wanted to say that I, for one, am very excited to have you present about data engineering because I think it's getting a lot more attention nowadays, also within Azure and within the cloud community in general. Um, I just had the fortunate to have like a small machine learning introduction, uh,
Yes.
which I thought was awesome in discovering how to use modules for AI learning, etc. But it also made me realize how important data engineering is nowadays to make sure that we understand the data and interpret it in the correct way.
Yeah,
Um,
it's very true.
yeah, so I decided to not get a whole topic on pet pythons this evening.
I mean, we could, right? So if you
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
change the topic, then I'll
We could
improvise.
also have you do another session about pet pythons, but I don't want to spoil the fun for the festive tech calendar, so
Of
uh, I'm
course.
not gonna
Yeah.
put you on the spot here.
I was
Um,
saying like the data lake for my snake. It sounds so funny, so I just decided to continue going with this.
yeah,
And
that makes sense.
actually, we're going to an event in Vienna in December. And actually, the entire event is going to be about building a data lake for my snake. And we're even having him drawn as a cartoon character and everything. So we're going all out. So,
Wow.
yeah, if
Cool.
you happen to live in Vienna, which I am not sure a lot of people will be, but then definitely attend at the Microsoft office, I would say.
Awesome. So I guess this also means that we need to make a note, Roland, that we will re-invite Lisa again as a speaker next year to hear more about these whole snake adventures, because that sounds like a lot of fun too. But I would prefer to do that in person. So yeah, we're gonna put some more effort in finding a new hybrid event mix. Even if it's maybe 1 month virtual and 1 month in person, but we're definitely gonna try to get you back and hear more about these pet snake stories.
Would be lovely. Thank you.
Yes, so I think I stalled enough time for all of us. um, um, yeah, I didn't want to steal away your introduction, because I basically assumed that you would introduce yourself for those in the community that have not yet heard of you, which
Which are
would
a lot
only
of
be like
people.
like
No.
1 or 2 persons.
Yeah. If you see me on Twitter, I have like, I don't know, 50 followers maybe. So I mean, I'm huge. Yes.
Yes. Oh, after tonight, we'll make sure it's like 52. So that will be awesome.
Well, looking forward to it. I mean, percentage-wise, it's a huge change. So yeah.
Yeah, especially with Elon Musk buying Twitter. So I'm not sure if we're gonna get those high percentages in the near future.
We'll see what he does. Yeah, it's interesting times.
Yes, definitely. But I was very slowly trying to get to that cool moment where we, me and Roland, disappear into the background, and we give you the full stage and put the spotlight on you, Lisa, and hear all about your data engineering adventures.
Good stuff. Let's start.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the presenter mode. So I won't be able to see myself, and I won't be able to see the message either. So Esther, Roland, if you have questions, if people are asking questions, feel free to just pop in whenever or keep them at the end.
Yeah, I think that's on us to not fully explain the format to you correctly, Lisa. So normally we would let you do the presentations. We will collect the questions that we get on YouTube and our usual channels, and then have the Q&A in the end. So we'll definitely get back to you with any questions.
That's totally fine.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, so I assume everybody can see the slides, right? Yes. Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, or Azure Synapse Analytics. When to use what? I mean, I came up with this very sexy title, but I think it's quite informative. So today we're going to talk about these 3 tools, and more specifically, when to use what. So who am I? My name is Lisa Hoving. I work as an Azure data engineer at Intercept. Well, actually, last month I became the lead for data and AI at Intercept as well. So I think that's like a really big honor for me to be able to do this. But what I do for customers is I help them in migrating to the cloud, more specifically the Azure cloud, and with all the questions that they might have when they are in the cloud. And this is more specifically for the data solutions. So if you want to reach me, you always can, of course. As you've heard, I have a huge Twitter following. So you can reach me at Lizard08, which matches to the Python, of course. So what agenda do we want to talk about today? So I think half a year back, our CTO came to me and said, Lisa, data is happening, and we would love to have a talk about data. So then I started thinking, what questions do I get asked by customers most often? And one of the questions that I get asked most often is, okay, what data tool is right for my use case? And then I started thinking about it, because this decision is not an easy decision, right? And how am I even going to explain this? I know I always like to explain things by using a story. So I made up the story of Hank. And I'm still looking forward to meeting somebody at my talks that's actually named Hank, because I decided to map this to one of the most common Dutch names. But unfortunately, no such luck yet. So if you're named Hank, please let me know. I would be very pleased. So we're going to talk first about Hank and his use case. What does he need to do? And then step by step, we're going to help Hank in making a decision on what data tool is best for him. And this can be either Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics, or Azure Databricks. Of course, for us to make a good decision for Hank, we need to know what these tools are first. So that's the second topic we're going to talk about today. Then we're going to compare these tools. We're going to compare them based on functionality, based on performance, based on cost. And lastly, we're going to try to make a decision in a more subjective way. In the end, we'll reach our conclusion, when to use what. And actually, the funny thing was that if I speak somewhere, of course, I want to know what other speakers did. And I go to the Azure Thursday YouTube channel and I search by most listened to talks, what is popular, what does great. And actually, the talk that popped out for me was the topic of Dave Ruiter. And he had a topic and it was watched on the YouTube channel for over 4,000 times. So it was the best watched YouTube video on the channel. And the title was The Battle of Modern Data Architectures, Databricks versus Synapse versus ADF. And I thought, wow, that seems quite similar. So this talk of Dave was about 2 years ago. And the data world arguably looked very, very different then. So I think, in my talk, it's nice to have an update, but I didn't want to do so without contacting Dave. So Dave said that it was okay. I could indeed do this talk today. And I do want to honor him a bit, having the most watched YouTube video on the channel. That's amazing. So normally what I would do is I would go through all of these slides and then step by step, I would ask and, decide together what should Hank choose. Well, instead of that, in the style of Dave, I want to do something else. I want to put the data tools to the fire. Well, if you watch this chat, his talk, then you know what I'm speaking about. All right, so instead of choosing, we're going to try to eliminate. Before I start, some household announcements. So it's good to know that Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics, and Azure Databricks, these are huge topics by themselves. So I'm only going to speak about, 45 minutes, right? So what we cannot get around is this simplified view. What we're going to see here today is not an in-depth workshop. So it's going to be simplified. In the end, spoiler alert, decisions can be subjective. And that means that this is subject to bias. So what is my bias? Think about it. When I started working on Azure, I started working with Azure Databricks. So this is a tool that's very dear to my heart. So keep that in mind when you hear me speaking about Azure Databricks. In the end, these tools can be used for a huge variety of use cases. But my background is in data engineering. So that means that the view that I have, so the colored glasses that I'm wearing right now, are in that viewpoint of data engineering. So I might know a little bit less about, for example, data science or doing data analysis. And that's okay, but it's good to keep that in mind when you hear me speaking. If you want to join the conversation, of course, feel free to reach out to me via the socials or put in your question on the board. If you wanted to reach me today, but you couldn't, again, feel free to reach out because all forms of communication are welcome. Well, now we have this out of the way. Let's start with Hank. Who is Hank? What is his use case? Well, Hank is a BI specialist. He has been working for a large insurance company for already 20 plus years. I know, oh my God, Hank, that's some really solid experience. A lot more than me, that's for sure. His skills? Well, being a BI specialist, he will make all your graphs look super fancy. I wish I had that skill. Hank can use some SQL Server when he wants to, but of course he does most of his work in Power BI. What languages does he speak? Obviously Dutch, but also SQL and Python. Hank is a Dutch guy. He will never pay a penny too much. Most people here today will probably be Dutch and know what I'm speaking about, right? And Hank, as most people, likes cats. Very important information, of course. But what is the use case of Hank? So Hank's manager came to him and said, hey, Hank, I have some data on salespeople and what sales they closed. I want to know what salespeople outperformed going from month to month. So Hank needs to aggregate sales on salesperson per month. Hank has gotten some sales data, about 6 million records over 3 years. That's a lot of sales, right? And as is pretty standard in the world of data, we're going to store this in a parquet format. What does that look like? I don't think you guys can see my pointer here today, but I think the data that you see is quite large. So what we can see in the date column is the day that this sale was closed. You can see the salesperson that closed this sale, for example, Amber. It has gotten an idea and a product ID as well, and the product that she sold, being in this case a mortgage. And the sales amount that she sold it for. All of this data needs to be aggregated on salesperson per month so that the manager of Hank can see what salesperson outperformed from month to month. So what do we know? The data, about 6 million records over 3 years, is stored in a parquet format. Hank is going to go ahead and store this in a storage account, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Also pretty run-of-the-mill, ordinary stuff. In the end, Hank, being a BI specialist, wants to visualize this using Power BI. It's also very handy for his manager, right? But with what tool are we going to process this data and aggregate that data? Well, for that, we need to make a decision. But can we already make a decision? What tool to put to the fire? Is it going to be ADF, Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse Analytics? That, of course, we don't know. So what are these tools exactly? Let's start with Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory is a data integration tool. What does that mean? I mean, that sounds a bit odd, right? What this means is, with Azure Data Factory, we can do data ingestion and data transformation use cases. So data ingestion means getting data from point A, usually the source, to point B, in this case, the storage account. Data transformation can be something like substituting null values or cleaning out errors, but it can also be use cases like aggregating the data set, which is something Hank needs to do. Azure Data Factory uses a graphical user interface. All of the developers will be like, oh no, it's a drag and drop tool. Yes, it's a drag and drop tool. What things do we have in Azure Data Factory that we can build our pipelines in? Well, first of all, the thing called pipelines, that's pretty straightforward. But if we want to program Spark, or well, drag and drop Spark, we can utilize the data flows. If we want to have an environment that looks more like Power BI, but then specifically geared towards ingestion and transformation, then we can use Power Query. Where does the computational power of Azure Data Factory come from? It comes from the integration runtime, in the case of pipelines. But in the case of data flows, it comes from, well, Spark, and it's also called data flows, and you can configure this within the integration runtime as well. But the computational power is something different. What they've been saying for quite some years is that Azure Data Factory has over 90 built-in data sources. I am expecting it to be quite a lot more actually nowadays, but expect at least 90, I would say. So that's quite a lot. But what does that look like? Let's take a look. So this is the Azure Data Factory canvas. So what we see here is that I've created a pipeline. It's called aggregate sales. And then in the box where you see all of the arrows, you can see all of the tasks that I've created. I've created 2 data flows. One is called cabinet to pen, which was for another workshop. And I've also implemented the salesperson aggregate. And that's the one we have open actually at this moment, because you can see the gray box, right? Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not a Power BI gal, so I don't really work with Power Query that much, so I haven't created one, unfortunately. But I did create that data flow that we have open here, and you can see some tasks. So you can see that I'm importing the sales, I'm doing some aggregate on it, then I sort the data and I write it back to storage. The use case of Hank, right? Okay, well, this is the Azure Data Factory canvas. And it's nice to know why we would, what we would use Azure Data Factory for. But maybe more importantly, we should know why not to use Azure Data Factory, right? What are the downsides? So one of the big downsides to Azure Data Factory is these 90 integrated data sources. it's very easy to get used to Azure Data Factory and to get it up and running. And if you don't know how to code, this is a very, very big pleasure because you don't have to learn this. You can just drag and drop everything. But if these 90 integrated data sources doesn't include your data source, you have to custom code and you're going to have an incredibly bad time. It's going to take a lot of time. So before you deploy Azure Data Factory, keep this in mind. Think about it. Is my data source integrated or is it not? Because if it's not, it might be better to look for another tool. Due to the nature of the GUI, we have quite some downsides, I would say. So we have little flexibility beyond what's available, right? So you have these activities in the pipeline, for example, but there's not really a way to custom do anything. So you just have these activities. If you want to do something beyond what's available, you're going to have a bad time because you have to drag and drop everything as well. It's very difficult to create generic pipelines as what you would do with code because of the fact that you have to configure everything by hand, which can become quite cumbersome if you have a lot of the same or similar data sources that you want to do. It's not as easy as copying code or just calling the same function over and over again. And what about optimization? Can you really do optimization in Azure Data Factory? Not really, right? So if you have a pipeline running and the pipeline isn't really performing as well as you wanted, you cannot really go under the hood and look at what is happening here and optimize a few things. This is just not possible. But is that enough to put Azure Data Factory to the fire and to cross it off? I mean, probably not, right? Because Azure Data Factory, as you saw, is pretty suitable for implementing the use case of Hoving. So we have to look further. What about Azure Databricks? So Azure Databricks is what they call a data analytics platform. What does that mean? It means that we can do data ingestion and data transformation, much as what we could do with Azure Data Factory. But we can do more. We can do data analysis as well in Spark or using SQL. And we can even do small visualizations within the Azure Databricks platform. If you want to do Power BI, there is Power BI integration available. So if you're interested in that, it's good to note. Azure Databricks can be used by multiple disciplines, and they love to tell you that data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and BI specialists can all do their work in Azure Databricks. So if you can program SQL, you can work with Databricks, but if you can do Spark and other languages, you will work here just fine. So the work in Azure Databricks is usually done in notebooks, and I'll show you one later on. And this kind of looks like what you are used to with Jupyter notebooks, for example. People that are working or have worked on premise using, I don't know, an Hadoop cluster or the Cloudera clusters know that being able in Azure Databricks to set up a cluster within minutes, that's a huge pleasure. And every time I spin up a cluster, I think about these times on premise and I just laugh because, this is crazy. So we can do things so much faster in Databricks than that we could do, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. Azure Databricks always ensures that we can run the latest version of Apache Spark. So if you want to be the company that utilizes the newest versions and the newest shiny things, then Azure Databricks might be the tool for you. The languages that we speak here, well, just talked a little bit about it, but we can program SQL. But if you want to do Spark, we can also do Python, Scala, R, and Java. So R and Java are good to know for later on, so keep them in mind and I'll get back to it. What does an Azure Databricks notebook look like? Well, here we see the name that I put for the notebook. In this case, it was Experts Live because I was there, I don't know, a month ago or so. And you can see the cluster that I'm going to run it on. And with the small gray dot, I'm not sure that everybody can see it very clear, but this means that the cluster is currently not running. So all of the results that we see here is results from earlier on because I was a bit lazy, so I let the cluster time out and I just copied the code later on. But it's very good that, these clusters, they time out in the first place because else we would pay a lot of money for these clusters. And I don't want to, of course. and that we keep the results, because then I can, come back and look at them. So that's very good. Here in this cell, you can see I implemented the use case of Henk. So what I did here, I hope everybody can read it, is that I read in the data using spark.read.parquet, which is just a normal Spark thing with the path. And then I added some columns. I did a group by so that I could aggregate the sales. And I wanted to do that on salesperson per month. Then I renamed the column just to make it a little bit more clear. And then I wrote it back to storage. All right, cool. So that's the use case of Henk in an Azure Databricks notebook. And cool and all that we know why we should use Databricks, but for what things would we rather not use Databricks, or what are the downsides? Well, I think one of the huge downsides to Azure Databricks is that it takes technical knowledge to set it up right. So more than within Azure Data Factory, where you can, it's a little bit more clear, and yeah, in general, that this is just the case. But with Azure Databricks, if you deploy a workspace rights to Azure Databricks in a portal, and I'll show a video of that later on, but you also have to think about the rights to the data, who can see your data, but more importantly, who cannot, and what people are able to make the clusters, and what people should only be able to start clusters, for example. And all of these things you have to think about really, really well, because if you don't, you're going to have a very bad time, and ultimately maybe people will access your data that shouldn't be allowed to. In Azure Databricks, you cannot really easily get around writing code. So if you cannot write code and you don't want to learn, it might be better to go with Azure Data Factory, because code, everybody that codes knows code is craftsmanship. You really have to put in the time and the effort. And if you're not willing to do that, then Azure Databricks is not the tool for you. Some people might know this, others might not, but Azure Databricks is not a tool created by Microsoft. It's created by the people that actually created Apache Spark. And therefore, and maybe also because Databricks is on multiple cloud platforms, but I do find that connecting data sources to the Azure Databricks platform is a little bit more intuitive with other tools like Synapse Analytics and Azure Data Factory. And I think that just has to do with the fact that these tools are created by Microsoft. So they keep, in consideration the entire Azure platform. Meanwhile, for Azure Databricks, this might be less of a priority, I think. Okay. So what happens if you don't have your access rights right? So what happens if I revoke all the access in the portal, but Databricks actually has its own admin portal within the workspace? So what if I have access in the workspace itself, but not in the portal? Let's take a look. Okay, so I go home to Azure Databricks, and since I don't have any rights, you don't see anything. I'm logged in under my user. But hey, I remembered the URL of Databricks, so let's go there. And because I'm an admin there, I can access it just fine. I can access anything I want, all of the notebooks that I've created. I could even create clusters and spend a huge amount of money and access data. This is a situation that you never, ever, ever want to be in as an admin. So if you deploy Databricks, think about it carefully. There are rights within Azure Databricks and rights within the portal. Do it right, or you'll have a bad time. Okay. But is that enough to put Azure Databricks to the fire? I don't think so, right? We just saw that we could implement the use case of Henk pretty fine. And if we think about it right, Azure Databricks can really be a pleasure to use. So I'm not ready to put it to the fire yet. Let's look somewhere else. Azure Synapse Analytics. What is Azure Synapse Analytics? We're starting to see some similarities here, right? So Azure Synapse Analytics, a data analytics platform. We can do data ingestion and data transformation, much as we could with Azure Data Factory and Azure Databricks. We can do analysis too if we want. The data analysts and the Power BI people, or the BI specialists, I should say, can do their work pretty fine. If you want to do visualization, it's possible in Synapse as well. There even is Power BI integration. this is going to look quite similar. Multiple disciplines can use Azure Synapse Analytics. Data engineers, data scientists, data analysis can be done there as well by data analysts, and BI specialists can do their work fine here. So where does the computational power from this comprehensive platform, well, where does it come from? There are a lot of things that we can do with Azure Synapse Analytics. So if we want to query our data lake and do work there, we can query it using the Spark pools, which we can create in Azure Synapse Analytics. If you want to do more data warehousing work, so think of structured data, think of SQL queries, then we can use the SQL pools. These can be either dedicated or serverless, depending on your needs. If you want to do data integration, we have something called Synapse pipelines. And what this basically is a one-on-one copy of Azure Data Factory. So we actually have Azure Data Factory at our fingertips in Azure Synapse Analytics as well. I mean, how cool is that? Of course, we already know this computational power comes from the integration runtime. Okay, well, if you want to query log data, we have something in preview. It's called the Data Explorer. The computational power from the Data Explorer comes from these Data Explorer pools. What languages can we speak? Well, for Azure Synapse Analytics, keep in mind, we can do Python, Scala, SQL, and .NET. So in the other one, in Azure Databricks, we saw that we could do R and Java. This is not possible in Azure Synapse Analytics. But if you want to do .NET, then Azure Synapse Analytics is going to be the tool for you. As we already saw, there were a huge amount of environments that we can do our work in for Azure Synapse Analytics. But to keep it consistent, today I want to show you a notebook from Azure Synapse Analytics. This is for querying the data lake, which is of course the place where Hank's data is in, so that's very nice. And I can program this using Spark, and I selected my favorite language, which is Scala. And I've been told that this is quite old school already, so never thought that on my 29th birthday I would be called old school, but you know, these things happen because the world of data just goes so fast. What do we see here? We can see that I've created a notebook. It's called Notebook 1, so I wasn't really, being that inspired that day. I could have called it something different. And I have attached it to a cluster called Experts Live. And lastly, I implemented the code of Hank in a cell, much as what I did with Azure Databricks. So I read in the data, I add some columns, I group it, aggregate it, and rename the column, order the data, and write it back to storage. Here we see all of the tasks that were actually succeeding. So that's very nice. Seems like it worked. All right, that's good and all, right? But why would we not use Azure Synapse Analytics? Much as with Azure Databricks, it's good to know that Azure Synapse Analytics takes significant technical knowledge in order to set it up right. Think about it. All of these different environments, they can all have different rights, right? And we have the rights to the Synapse Analytics workspace in the portal, but we have also the rights to the data. We need to make sure that not the wrong people can see your data sets, or you're going to have a very bad time. Much as with Databricks, writing good code takes a specific skill set. This is craftsmanship, and this is something you have to learn. If you don't want to learn, then keep with the Synapse pipelines or keep with Azure Data Factory. There's actually no shame in that, and it can really be good to get going in your data journey. One of the other downsides of Azure Synapse Analytics, and keep in mind, it might become a bit subjective here, but for me, one of the major downsides of Azure Synapse Analytics, maturity. So I was implementing this use case of Hank, and I already came across two issues, that were a bit cumbersome, a bit annoying. So what I did in this first use case, you can see it with the small green arrow. I hope that everybody can see it right. Is I tried to use a Spark line of code, a Spark function. It's called .ag. And this ag function, if you put in, what do you want to aggregate? I put in the sum and the column, which was sales. What it does by default is it creates a column with brackets. So sum of sales in brackets. And this is something that Spark does out of, just by itself. Nothing wrong with that. Also, the storage format that I'm storing it in, Parquet, doesn't really limit me to using these special characters, especially not the brackets, right? These are pretty straightforward, pretty standard. But Synapse Analytics, for some reason, limits me to these brackets and says, well, this is not good. You cannot have sum of sales between brackets. You need to rename this. This is silly. We cannot write this to storage. Well, that's annoying because I just ran this on Databricks and that worked just fine. As a different example, some people that, especially people that share subscriptions, they might have seen this error before. So it's an error that you get when, because let's take a step back. So the computational power of Synapse Analytics Spark pools and Azure Databricks clusters, they come, of course, from VMs. And there is a maximum amount of VMs that you can deploy in your environment. And if a lot of people are deploying VMs, then you get to the situation that you're trying to create a cluster, but don't have a sufficient amount of VMs. So what Databricks does is they give you an error when you want to create the cluster. It says, this account might not have enough cores to satisfy this request because we have this much available and you're asking for that. So they're basically saying, well, Lisa, you're trying this, might be a bad idea. You could go for it if you wanted to, but if it errors or times out, not our fault. Okay, then you kind of know what you're dealing with. With Azure Synapse Analytics, it will just allow you just fine to create a cluster. It doesn't really give an error. But then after it has tried for, 5 minutes or so, then you get the error. Your Spark job requested 20 vCores. However, the pool has a 12-core limit. And this really refers back to these limitation in the amount of VMs that I have for my subscription on that time. That really sucks. If you've been running Cree for 5 minutes, been waiting on it, might have gotten a cup of coffee or went to the bathroom. You come back and you see that it didn't work. That really grinds my gears. But is it enough to put Azure Synapse Analytics to the fire? I mean, not really, right? You have to start comparing these tools. Let's compare them based on functionality. I have 2 slides prepared. Azure Data Factory, of course, uses a GUI, a graphical user interface. For Databricks, you cannot really get around using code, and for Synapse Analytics, meaning that it has these Synapse pipelines, which is a version of Azure Data Factory, integrated within, we can use both the graphical user interface and code. When it comes to Azure Data Factory, keep in mind it's only really suitable for data ingestion and data transformation use cases. What it is definitely not suitable for is data science, data analysis, and data visualization use cases. So keep it in mind. If you have a use case that needs this, Azure Data Factory is not the tool for you. Both Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, so many tools. Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics can solve all these use cases just fine. We can do data ingestion, data transformation, data science, data analysis, and even data visualization. Oh, this is going to be a difficult choice. If we want to program Spark, then Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics will do the job just fine. If you want to utilize the powers of Apache Spark, but you don't really want to code it, then you can also use the data flows in Azure Data Factory. I think data storage is always one of these funny things to talk about. Even when I was doing my talk for Experts Live, I had like a really, really similar topic. They send out a tweet and they say, in the world of data storage tools, which one to pick? And I think it always makes me laugh a bit because in these tools, officially, you don't store data. Even though Azure Data Factory is called a factory, we don't really store anything within it. When it comes to the workspace of Azure Databricks, you do get a small portion to store data, but this is not intended for production data. So maybe store a jar or store some code there or some practice data or write something back that you need later on. But please, please don't put your production data in there. It's not intended for that. Azure Synapse Analytics actually doesn't really store data within the workspace as well, because you get this data lake, Azure Data Lake storage with it. So in Azure Synapse Analytics, I mean, I put a question mark there because we can have a debate on the topic, but I think, no, you don't really store data in Azure Synapse Analytics. I got a question, I think a few weeks back, from people asking, can we do streaming use cases in using these tools? To start off, batch processing, processing it per hour, per day, per week, go your gang. It's very possible. For Azure Data Factory to do streaming, please correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't really seen people doing it. I don't think it's very perfectly suitable for that. I don't think you can connect things like Event Hub to it. So I wouldn't go that route. For Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, I'm having a rough time. Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, we can do streaming use cases doing Spark structured streaming. But the question is here whether you should want to do it. Because having a cluster running 24/7, this can become quite expensive quite fast. And if you don't need that computational power the entire time, then maybe going with Azure Event Hub, Stream Analytics, IoT Hub, or some other streaming solution might be more cost effective for you. So think about it before you do it, please. But based on this functionality, can we put any of these tools to the flames? I mean, please. I don't think so, right? I mean, we saw all of these tools implementing the use case of Hank. So we have to look further. Is cost going to give us the answer that we want? Because as we know, Hank is Dutch, so he's a cheapskate. He would rather not pay too much. I'm so sorry, Hank. I have to disappoint. Because think about it. Is comparing it using cost that easy? These tools, they use quite a lot of different technology, right? So think about it. What if you wanted to do the serverless pools in Synapse Analytics and we were to do normal pipelines in Azure Data Factory? Would these tools be so easily compared just based on what they cost per hour or per minute? Not really, right? So these tools, they are so different. Can we really compare them based on cost? I mean, I always like to try. So I created 3 clusters. I did this a month back, so please don't come for me if the costs are a little bit different. But I tried to create 3 Spark clusters because Spark, of course, that's a technology that all of these 3 tools use. And I tried to create some similar, but not 100% similar clusters. And that's already your first issue, because even if you want to compare a technology which is Spark that they all use, we cannot even create clusters that are 100% similar. But still, let's just compare. What we see here is that Azure Databricks is the cheapest option for this cluster comparison. But do keep in mind that for Synapse Analytics, we have a little bit more computational power. So this can also be the reason why we see this difference. So the pricing is quite similar for Spark. But then for Azure Data Factory, we see that it's quite a lot more expensive to do these data flows than just to program Spark yourself using Databricks or Synapse Analytics. So usually, if we think about this even further, if we were to compare these clusters, then if we think about the Apache Spark that is utilized within these clusters, then what we would see is that the Apache Spark that is used within Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics, and Azure Databricks, they are not the same type of Spark as the Spark that you download, which is open source from the Apache Spark website. All these tools, they try to optimize Spark in their own clusters in a way that Spark performs better. So better than what you could just download from the open source Apache Spark website. But the way they are optimized, that's different. So that means that even though if we could create these 3 clusters that were exactly the same, which we can't, and we were to compare the costs, which we shouldn't, then still these tools wouldn't do the job equally fast because they are all optimized different under the hood. So that makes it really, really difficult to get a proper comparison on cost, because all of these tools don't use the same techniques. But even if we compare a technique that is the same, they don't use the same cluster, they don't use the same Apache Spark, so they will never finish equally fast. But if you are so inclined to do so, to make a decision on cost, then know that what we see with customers at this moment is that the data flows are not cheap. I mean, we've seen it here before. $2.15 per hour versus $1.37. That's quite a big difference. Usually what we see with customers is that if they switch from data flows to programming Spark themselves, usually that results in a cost decrease. So keep it in mind. Well, what about performance? I mean, usually performance is key, right? Sorry, Hank, but let's just try. So I've implemented the use case of Hank 3 times for all of the free tools. What do we see here? In the left graph, we see the processing time of all of these 3 runs. The first thing that comes to mind, what you can see, is that Azure Data Factory, for the people that are colorblind, it's the first bar for all of these runs. It finishes equally fast, and that's because Azure Data Factory doesn't cache the results under the hood. Azure Databricks, which is the second bar, and Azure Synapse Analytics, which is the third, they do finish faster for the second and third run, and this has to do with that caching. So they can finish faster. Meanwhile, Azure Data Factory cannot. Here you saw that for the use case of Hank, which is important, it's the use case of Hank, Synapse Analytics actually for the first run in this use case, in this run, was the slowest, which was, I think, quite surprising. Azure Databricks runs fastest for well, actually not the first run, but the second and the third. If we then translate this back to cost, so cost per run, then you see that Azure Databricks is the cheapest tool for the use case of Hank throughout all of the runs. And then it's Azure Synapse Analytics and then Azure Data Factory. But can we really make that decision so fast? Because even though for our use case, we saw that Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics weren't really outperformers on the processing time. This is just a use case of Hank, right? I mean, you're not going to go, while you're already home, you're not going to be at home and implement only the use case of Hank. If you're going to choose a data tool, you're going to consider other use cases as well. So is the performance difference the same if we were to use Synapse SQL versus Databricks SQL? Or what if I wanted to save my results in Delta Lake instead of a Parquet? Is the performance difference then the same? Well, probably not, right? Maybe Azure Synapse Analytics will perform very well for these use cases. We just don't know. And even if we were to know, would it then still be a good thing to base our decision on performance? Probably not, because this is a moving target. Microsoft puts a lot of time and effort into improving Synapse Analytics, and Azure Databricks does as well. They also put in a lot of time and effort and money to bring new things out every quarter. So if we were to make a decision on performance today, then tomorrow it might all be different. All right. So if we want to make a decision on performance, I would say please don't, because they are rarely a good decision maker, as we've seen. But again, if you are so inclined to do so at this moment, and please be aware this might be a bit biased, but because there are some people that really disagree with me on this point, so keep that in mind. But the general consensus that I see happening at this moment is that Azure Databricks performs best. And that's also coherent with what we're seeing for the use case of Hank. All right. Before we move on, let me really check that I'm still in the air. Yes, okay, that seems to be good. Okay. Always good to check, right? Don't want to be talking to myself for an hour. That would be a bit silly. So Henk was thinking, right? I want a tool that is suitable for my use case. And then we saw the functionality. And we saw that all of these 3 tools could implement this use case just fine. So Henk thinks, I'm a Dutch guy, just give me the cheapest one and we'll be done with it. Actually, Henk, it's not that easy. Should we really be basing our decision based on the cost? Can we really even make that decision? No. Well, then Henk thinks, just give me the best performing one. Because I don't like waiting. I mean, nobody likes waiting. So if I can find a tool that performs best, I'll have a nice time. Everything will be good. Sorry, Henk, I don't think performance is a good decision maker. So what are we left off with? In my personal experience, this is usually a question. So when it comes to Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, that is, because let's take a step back. If we want to make a decision for Azure Data Factory, I think the decision is quite easy, because if you don't want to code and you want to do Spark, for example, you don't mind to pay the premium, or you just use the pipelines, then Azure Data Factory is an amazing tool, and it's a great stepping stone if you want to get into the world of data. So if you don't want to code, please go ahead with Azure Data Factory. But making a decision between Databricks and Synapse Analytics is much more difficult, because both of these tools can pretty much tackle the same use cases. In my experience, usually the decision between Azure Synapse Analytics and Azure Databricks is a maturity versus integration question. As we've seen, in general, Azure Databricks, at least at this moment, maybe not in the future, is a more mature platform. It's a little bit easier to work with, and you don't really run into these silly mistakes. This makes a lot of sense, right? Because when we go back to the talk of Dave, I don't think Azure Synapse Analytics even really was a thing. I think that was just the data warehousing type of solution. So Azure Synapse Analytics hasn't been in the game that long. So hopefully this will improve a lot. But if you want to go with a more mature platform right now, then go with Azure Databricks. Go with Azure Synapse Analytics if you need a platform that integrates very well within the Azure stack. If you have colleagues that cannot code and colleagues that do know how to code, then you will find a friendly environment where we have our GUI and code integrated together. And we will find a familiar look and feel for Azure users that are acquainted with the Azure platform. So Henk, which tool are we going to put to the fire? Finally. I mean, in the end, it's not that easy. But let's recap real quick. Azure Data Factory comes in handy for users that don't know how to code. It's not suitable for users that need to solve data science, data analysis, or data visualization use cases. As we've seen, it's only a data integration tool. We can do data ingestion and data transformation with it. Azure Data Factory, being a GUI, gives us less flexibility than code, but that's amazing if you don't know or don't want to code. If you want to use Apache Spark, then we can do so using the data flows. But this one usually comes at a premium. And that's the thing Henk doesn't like. So this one we're going to put to the fire. Then, Azure Databricks offers us a mature and user-friendly platform. But before you set it up, ensure that you have the technical knowledge that is required to set it up correctly. Because if you don't, you're going to have a bad time. But Henk doesn't mind a user-friendly platform, so let's keep this one for now. Azure Synapse Analytics. The same as with Azure Databricks. Setting it up requires technical knowledge. Please think about it. Who can see your data? More importantly, who should not be able to see your data? If we use Azure Synapse Analytics, we will find a very well integrated platform on Azure. if we are acquainted with the Azure platform, we will find a look and feel that you might be familiar with. And this is exactly the reason as to why I would advise Azure Synapse Analytics to Hank. Because Hank is already acquainted with SQL and SQL Server. So setting up Azure Synapse Analytics will probably take less time for Hank because he will find a look and feel that he is familiar with. So I'm setting Databricks to the flames. So because I always like this kind of decision graph, and I think it's nice if you're on YouTube, you can pause it if you're looking back. So how do we make a decision? If you don't know how to code and you don't feel like learning, and you've checked that your data sources are natively integrated within the Azure Data Factory platform, and you don't have many transformations that are similar, so we don't have a need for generic pipelines, then please, yes, go ahead with Azure Data Factory. But if you know how to code and you are acquainted with the Azure platform, you're left with one question. Do we care about maturity, or do we care about an integrated platform on Azure? If we care about maturity, go ahead with Azure Databricks. If we care more about integration, go with Azure Synapse Analytics. That leaves me with a big thank you. My name is Lisa Hoving. I work for Intercept. And if you want to reach me, feel free to do so via LinkedIn or send me a tweet. Are there any more questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I have questions.
Or is maybe that's maybe not good.
No, it's very good because while I was trying to understand all the different steps and arguments that you had for your tool selection, to put it in a simplified way, I noticed that for me personally, it was a lot of trying to understand your the Dutch word is referentiekader. So your world of truth back to my world of understanding. So there's a lot of terminology that I had to try to figure out, but that helped in coming up with some questions that I had. So
okay, good.
do you want me to fire off, Roland, or do you want to introduce some of the questions that you may have?
Let's alternate. That's you start, then I'll do one. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, the one question that popped up when you started to compare the different solutions is if it's even at all possible to make the complex process of data analytics more accessible to noobs like me. Or should we just accept that it does take specialized skills to be able to have useful analysis of the data? Because that's one of the questions that I had. Because I found during the presentation that you are awesome at simplifying and making sure that I can keep up with everything that is required, or the process of data analytics. But I also realized that it does take a specialized skill set to do good data analytics. And it's not something that I feel I should be able to master within like a week, or even though I love coding.
Then don't go with Azure Data Factory, that's for sure. Well, it's a difficult question, right? Because on the one hand, we want our platforms to be accessible to anybody, because as data engineers, I mean, we want a lot of people to be working with us, and also stakeholders to be able to understand what's actually going on. It's extremely important. But then, as I've shown, so setting up this platform the right way, that does take quite some knowledge, and then coding the right way also takes some knowledge. So I think in the ideal situation, you would have a little bit of both. So you would have a team where you have a sufficient amount of experienced people that really ensure that everything goes well. But you also have some people that are maybe a bit more towards the business and that want to learn. And then I think you have a very healthy team. but definitely don't go for a data project without any specialty. Like it's not a good way. It's not fun. It's not safe. So
Yeah, that's what I figured, because I know Microsoft goes through great length to make it very easy to get started with using data analytics, machine learning,
yeah,
artificial intelligence, because they have that mission statement to make it available and usable for everyone in the world. But I just had that question. Should we really strive for that, or should we just accept that we do need the specialists in the world to get the
yeah.
results that we are looking for?
Don't forget, it's with data, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if your data isn't right and you're doing all of these fancy models, then it's not going to be useful. So
Oh,
yeah, we have to think about these things very carefully before we go ahead and create all these fancy models and visualizations and stuff like that. Yeah.
that makes sense. And to continue with the other question that basically links to this as well, is that you explained that you can that the different solutions have different cluster configurations for
Mm-hmm.
the Apache Spark part especially.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that means that we can only like pre-select the Microsoft templates, or are we also able uh, to customize our own data clusters by making additional optimizations?
So I think that's a very good question, because that's the whole point. For all of these tools, that's different. So for a Synapse, I have, I think, compute optimized and memory optimized. Don't come for me if it's not 100% the right term, but you have two different, and then you can say, well, I want one with this amount of nodes. But with Azure Databricks, for example, you can do the driver and the worker node separately, and then you can choose different VMs, and you have much more decisions to make on the VMs. But then with Azure Data Factory, we have the least amount of things that we can do. I think we can just select a few sizes. And then the question becomes, but wait, if I select that type of VM for Databricks, what type of VM is that in Azure Data Factory?
Yeah,
And can I even choose it? And can I choose it in Synapse? And I've spent so many hours on trying to get these similar, like that you don't see on the one slide, like all of the time I put into it. It's difficult. I find it, at least, extremely difficult, and it's not even exactly the same. So yeah.
yeah. So back to, we need the specialists. Awesome.
Yes. That looks so many hours on pricing. Yes.
Yes. Should I continue with the questions, Roland, or do you want to pitch in as well?
I have a question burning here, so tell me one, and then you can continue, because Lisa, I really loved how you made these choices really accessible to people not native to the domain, and me, and I think Esther as well. We understand what are the drivers between these choices we have to make. For us noobs, as Esther referenced
Kindly
us.
refers to myself. Yeah.
Yeah, but I heard it. No. That is, but it's totally true. This is not my domain of expertise. So we now have all these beautiful services to choose from. We can choose, but does it make sense in some way to ever combine two? So you have maybe best of both worlds. Of course, not from a cost perspective, because then, well, it's probably cumulative. It's a sum of the costs. But does it make sense to combine, for example, the Data Factory or Databricks and Synapse Analytics?
It's a very good question, actually, because a lot of companies that I work for with Intercept, they are new to the world of data. So they say, well, we want to have the stepping stone and do Azure Data Factory, but what about if we're ready to go a little bit further? Or what if we have a lot of pipelines that need to be generic and we really have to code? Well, in that case, what we often do is we combine Azure Data Factory and Azure Databricks together, because what we can do in Azure Data Factory is we have these activities, these tasks, where we can kick off a notebook for Azure Databricks, actually, and you can even put in some of the results of other activities back into the Databricks notebook, so we can really make these parameters and make that efficient.
Cool.
So I think that's really cool. And of course, with Synapse Analytics, we have the pipelines integrated within it, so that's also very possible.
Okay, well, perfect.
Wow.
Can I do one small question, Esther?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the last one for me. But you told us, of course, Databricks is not a Microsoft native solution. It is they're using it as an industry standard. And of course, Azure Synapse Analytics is native Microsoft. Do you see more traction on Azure Synapse Analytics in regard to shiny new features? Because, well, you said the Databricks is much more mature, so probably it has most of the features it needs. But is there, from Microsoft's perspective, more traction on Synapse Analytics, or is it about the same?
Compared to Databricks, you mean?
Yeah, compared to Databricks.
I think they're about equal, because Databricks is also a huge company, and there is a huge user base for Databricks, probably even bigger than Synapse Analytics. So the amount of investment that they do in Databricks is huge, and the amount of investment that they do in Synapse Analytics is also really huge. And yeah, they're not managed by the same company, so you can imagine that they're really going against one another to be the best platform out there. So
yeah, and of course, Synapse Analytics, only Microsoft is probably driving that, and Databricks is a much bigger community. Okay, well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's clear. That was it for me, Esther. So
You sure? You sure?
Yeah.
I'm just
Sorry.
waiting
Yeah.
like two more seconds.
Eagerly waiting.
So you had this awesome slide where you had the different runs of the 3 solutions. But I did notice that with Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, the sequential runs like run 2 and run 3 had way drop in costs.
Yeah.
And what seemed like the length of time that was needed.
Yeah.
Can you maybe help me understand, because that feels like that whole cost conversation that Hank, and me being Dutch, I would probably have too.
Yeah.
Feels like it's not a linear decision to make now, because if sequential runs for Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics are way shorter, then that can become more interesting to invest in what seems a more expensive solution, but seems also to be cheaper if you have multiple runs and you know for sure that you're going to have like a huge sequence of runs with that.
Yeah, so what you actually see there is just a nifty trick, so to speak. So actually, what is very special about Spark is that Spark as a language, what it does is, on the computer when it processes, is for every step that it does, it tries to keep everything in memory. And that means that by doing so, Spark is a lot more fast than what we've seen with Hadoop or MapReduce previously, which always wrote back to storage, which takes a huge amount of time. And this nifty trick that we see here that apparently Azure Data Factory doesn't do is they just keep the results in memory. So that when you call it back, it's like, hey, I just did that before and I still know what it is. And then you get the same result back within, almost instantly. So they don't really have to pull it from anywhere. But for some reason, Data Factory doesn't do it. So, yeah.
Okay, so that definitely could be something that you need to consider as well.
If you run a lot of the same things, or maybe parts of, of another result, then yeah, this is a huge difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I had one more question, and I hope that I formulated it correctly. I was wondering if we would use the cost versus performance data and run that through, for instance, Azure Databricks. Would Azure Databricks basically be biased and say that it would be the best solution to run that analytics? And should we have like a battle of Databricks versus Data Factory, or is that something that might only happen in the movies?
Probably in the movies. I mean, as Dutchies, we say, wij van WC Eend raden aan WC Eend.
Yeah,
So
that's basically what I was referring to.
probably,
the
yes.
bias that I meant. Yeah.
But one of the things I found very interesting, and I totally forgot the person's name because I'm incredibly bad with names, is that, I mean, when I was making this talk, I was looking at, can I find really a comprehensive benchmark that, really puts these tools to the test, also with different techniques, different storage formats, whatever. And I found this benchmark, and it was really, really nice and super comprehensive. And I thought, this is amazing. So I have to send this person a chat saying, thank you so much, for all of the work. And then he sent me back a text saying, hey, yeah, thanks for looking at my blog post. But actually, I know I just created this last month, but they came out with a huge amount of new things and everything is different now. And I have to update everything. So nothing is valid anymore. So,
Oh, wow.
So that's how fast it goes. And that's why I say, don't base the decision on performance, because it's such a moving target.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that also gets us back to that whole we need the specialized personnel to operate this, because if it's so fastly changing and improving in the whole performance part as well, then I'm very happy that we have you, Lisa, to help us find our way in this, like Roland said, this whole new domain for us. So with that, I basically just want to say thank you for helping me understand this whole magical world of data engineering. And I don't have any questions left.
Thank you so much for having me, I would say.
I'd probably wake up like 2 a.m. This night and come up with more questions, but I'll promise to not spam you till like 9 a.m. tomorrow.
You can always tweet me or give me a call. You have my number, so yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just not 2 a.m. maybe.
No, that's what I figured. I'll just make a note and get back to you at a more convenient time.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. It was an excellent session. Sorry to take up so much of your time, because of course we had the kind of luxury to run late because it's already, we're half past what we planned for the session. So thank you so much. It was awesome.
Thank you. I had a blast. I'm so happy to be here. So yeah, thank you for making me part.
We really hope you will be back with us for an in-person meetup, because we loved having you. So we'll definitely be in touch for either our data questions or to plan a new in-person event. So thank you so much, and thank the rest of all of being here for
sticking with us and all the questions.
For over a half an hour of questions and Q&A, and but of course it was an amazing session, so people stuck around, and I think Dave will have a run for his money for the viewing usage statistics on YouTube. So
we'll see. His talk was pretty great too, so I wouldn't dare say it.
Well, we will. We do. No, it was amazing. So thank you so much, and we hope we will see everyone for our December edition. And we can spoil that it will be the 15th of December instead of the 1st of December, because we are, of course, the first Thursday of every month, except for next month, which will be the 15th, so the third Thursday of September. So that's a real tongue twister.
December, right?
December, yeah.
Yes. Because we figured with all the holiday season kicking off in December, the 15th was like this nice moment in between what we Dutchies call the Sinterklaasgekte and Christmas getting sneaking up on us already. So we figured to make sure that we also had a treat for that little moment of time where you're lost in having no more Sinterklaas gifts to unwrap or food like the pepernoten, which of course everyone loves, next to the stroopwafels. But before you get to that Christmas dinner. So we wanted to make sure that we had a special treat for you as well in December.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that one. And thank you. And special thanks to you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
See you next time. Bye bye.